in all of these places that you are keeping alive, the same as we're doing with the Oak Hill Cemetery that we're talking about, or Pioneer Cemetery in Lawrence. It's people like all of us who really make history, and it's often some of the people who are in the shadows, like the First Ladies, who are also making history. And it's important, if we're really going to have an inclusive history and we're going to talk about the presidency, that we have to talk about First Ladies. Because from the first moment that Martha Washington arrived in New Jersey, about a month after George Washington became president, she wasn't there for the inauguration, she traveled from Mount Vernon, she met him on the New Jersey shore, he brought the presidential yacht and took her over to New York, because that's where our first capital was, and he handed her a list of responsibilities. She didn't like some of them, but nonetheless, she was a good partner, and she agreed to do what he and his cabinet had asked her to do. And the reason he gave her that list of responsibilities is we have a really unique system of government. Our president is both the head of the government and the head of state. And so, they pardon turkeys on Thanksgiving, and they cut ribbons, and they do all sorts of ceremonial things, but they also propose budgets and policies, and they have executive orders. And in other countries, you have a monarch or you have another public official who does all of that state work. Well, he knew, forming a country, he couldn't spend a whole lot of time on arranging who was going to sit by whom at a table. And so Martha became an integral part of what he was doing. And she was with him by his side at every dinner that he hosted. She met diplomats. She used what we call soft diplomacy, soft power. And Martha also showed that she was a part of the presidency. He was ill not long after he was inaugurated, and after she got there, and one of the generals from the Revolutionary War died, and she went in his place. And it's like, the president is here, I'm here, the presidency is here. So that was a really important statement to make at the beginning. So these women have made history. They're more than the women behind the men. Some of the time they were pushing them. In fact, one of the things that was really obvious when we wrote this book was that these women often were the reason that they became president. And we often don't think about the fact that some of them were better educated. We know Mary Lincoln certainly was, and she took some of the rough edges off of Abraham, but she wasn't the only one. There are several others, and I'll talk about some when we get going. So we need to study them because they are an important part of American history. If we really want to understand the presidency and what some of these presidents did, we've got to know what these women did. So then the next question is, why did you write the books? Well, actually, we wrote 2 books. About 4 years ago, I got an email on my St. Louis University email from a publishing company that had come to me a few years before when I was an associate provost and I did not have time to write books, and said, well, I understand you're retired. Do you have time now to write a book, and what would you like to write a textbook about? And I had taught a course at KU as part of my political communication courses on women in politics, and I always included a unit on First Ladies. And the students loved it, and they said, why did we not learn this in history classes? And so would you do an entire semester? And even in a semester, we could not begin to cover it all. But I didn't have a textbook, so I had to cobble these things together. And there are a lot of people now who are starting to teach units of history courses or entire courses on First Ladies. So I proposed a textbook. They did their research. They said, fine. So I said, if I'm going to do this and do the entire history of First Ladies from Martha Washington to Jill Biden, I can't do this alone in less than 10 years. So I have 2 friends I would like to write with me. One is Anita McBride, who was Laura Bush's chief of staff in her 2nd term, and Nancy Keegan Smith, and we've been involved in an organization, I have the little pin, called FLAIR, which we are founders of. We're 3.5 years old, First Ladies Association for Research and Education. We have an incredible website. We do virtual programs, and they're all open to the public. So if you go on the FLAIR website, First Ladies Association for Research and Education, or FLAIR, you can look at any of our past programs. And we bring in experts from across the country to talk about various aspects of First Ladies. So they said, yeah, we think they're qualified to write. So we wrote the textbook. And the editor was enthralled. she kept waiting, like, when's the next chapter coming, because this is so interesting, and she said the same thing, why didn't I learn any of this in my history classes? So when we were about finished with the textbook, she said, how would you like to convert it to a book for the public, what they call a trade book? So book number 2, we have the blue book and the red book, and this is the book that somebody's going to win. And I did bring some if anybody wants to buy one. There are a few extras here. So we converted it. And the great thing was, once we took all the textbooky stuff out, we had about 50 more pages of content we could add. So all these things that were on the cutting room floor from the textbook are now in here. It was also a year later, and there was new material that we had uncovered. And one of those pieces I'm going to share with you in a couple minutes. So let me give you just a quick run through of some of the things that first ladies did that we did not learn in school. So I've already told you about Martha. Abigail Adams.
Got something on your screen.
Oh, okay. Oh, that's weird. It's not showing up on mine. Huh. I don't know if I can't get rid of it. Ignore it. It'll go away. Abigail did 2 things that are important. One good, one bad. They didn't always do good things to affect history. Abigail took it upon herself to basically be John Adams' press secretary. She would write letters and then send them to family members promoting his policies and say, send this to a newspaper, exactly as I wrote it for you. And then she had some friendly editors who'd let her submit them anonymously. So she's controlling the narrative of the Adams administration. Now, on the negative side, she told him to push for the Alien and Sedition Act and to sign it. And that's part of why he lost. And if you've been paying attention, the Alien and Sedition Act has been in the news again. It's an 18th century act, and it's being used, we won't get political, as a possible way for deportations. So it has not gone away. So that is, unfortunately, one of Abigail's negative legacies. And I think it's only fair. One of the things that people have complimented us on with the book is its balance. We do not show favorites. We show the positives and the negatives of all of these women. Dolly Madison. We bemoan the fact we don't have much bipartisanship now. If you think things are bad now, remember how Hamilton met his end? He wasn't the only one. I mean, it was much more contentious, and Bill Wagner can probably give lots of examples of that from the early days. Parties were starting to form by Jefferson's time. It was contentious. And Dolly Madison used her soft power, used the East Room of the White House for receptions where she brought all the parties together and sort of forced them to be nice to one another. She created a bipartisan atmosphere, and people credited her with that. She also saved George Washington's portrait. And not only did she save the portrait, but she gathered up as many of the papers, because Adams was off looking at the troops and getting ready for this battle. And she was really the first archivist. She knew she had to preserve those papers. So Dolly saved some very important aspects of our history. Julia Tyler. People don't know much about her. She was only First Lady for 8 months. She was Tyler's second wife. His first wife, Letitia, died about a year in. She was ill and never recovered from the illness. And Julia was 30 years younger. My students love this story. It's 30 years younger. They had 7 children, and their last grandson, there are no greats in front of this, the last Tyler grandson just died about 2 years ago. He was about 100. Because Tyler was 30 years older than she was. They had 7 kids over a long period of time, and you do the math. But Julia encouraged him to annex Texas. And as a result of that, she was the first lady to ever be depicted in a political cartoon. And when he signed the annexation bill, he gave her the first pen, and she made a necklace out of it. She also started the tradition of hail to the chief and standing when the president came in. So 8 months, but she did some significant things. Anybody ever heard of Sarah Polk? No. One of the most powerful first ladies we ever had, who no one has heard of. There is a wonderful book, put it on your reading list, called Lady First. And it's how Sarah Polk in the 1840s stayed behind the scenes and basically helped run this administration. She had more access to the president. She read the papers every morning, gave him a summary of what he needed to know. She controlled his schedule. When he ran for governor of Tennessee, she basically, helped coordinate that whole campaign. And when he was out campaigning for his second term, she was basically running the Tennessee government. So very, very powerful woman, but she was also coached by Dolly Madison. So she also used all of these social events. And the way she would get to members of Congress to convince them was that she would mask what she believed by saying, Mr. Polk believes. And so she would then introduce her own ideas. Very clever woman, Sarah Polk. Eliza Johnson, Andrew Johnson's wife. Eliza attended 2 events in 4 years. She was also very ill, but she was far better educated than Johnson, and she got him into, guess what, speech and debate activities when they first got married, to join a debating society to hone his skills. And then he eventually became a lawyer. What she did that probably changed history was she helped craft his defense at his impeachment trial. And we all know Rossville, named after Senator Ross, who cast the deciding vote to not convict him. He was not convicted. But Eliza was a lot of the brains behind his defense. So she helped make history. Edith Roosevelt. Edith is the one responsible for the West Wing. Up until the Roosevelts and their rambunctious 5 children, the president's office is what we now call the Lincoln bedroom. That was the office. It was right by the other bedrooms. And their kids were terrors from all accounts. Would put things on people's chairs before they sat down, brought a pony up, running it up and down the hall where he was having meetings. And she just said, this cannot continue. So the West Wing got built, except for the Oval Office. That came later. And so she hired the very first paid position for a first lady. Up until 1901, everyone who helped out did it as a volunteer for the first lady. They worked out of closets, they worked out of dressing rooms, they worked off the kitchen table, and so she gets the West Wing. She also was responsible in many ways for him winning the Nobel Peace Prize. He was our first president to win the Nobel Peace Prize. And the way she did it was she and Theodore had a secret marriage in London. They had grown up together, they thought they were going to get married. He went off to Harvard, met Alice, married her. She dies right after she has their daughter, Alice, who became Alice Roosevelt Longworth, the Longworth Building in DC, named after Alice's husband. And they then got back together, but they wanted to have a secret wedding. She was doing her grand tour. He met her and her mother in London, but on his way over, he met a man named Cecil Spring Rice, who eventually became the British ambassador to Russia during the Russo-Japanese War. And she engaged in a conversation with him about what was going on in Russia and what was going on with the war. And she also had a similar correspondence relationship with the U.S. ambassador, because Theodore could not talk, especially to a foreign ambassador. So there are 12 of those letters that are on the Theodore Roosevelt website. She then would tell Theodore what she was hearing from their good friends. And he used some of that to craft the final mediation that got that war ended. And then he gets a Nobel Prize. Does Edith get any recognition? No. And I've looked at biographies of Theodore Roosevelt talking about him ending it, not a word about Edith, but it was important. Her great-grandson was at a program that Nancy, Anita, and I did a year ago in Washington, and he came up to us afterwards and said, where did you get that information? I've never heard it. You've got to prove to me it's true. Nobody in the family's ever talked about it. So I gave him the website with the 12 letters. He never answered me back. But the bottom line was the family didn't even know about it. Lou Henry Hoover, she would have been one of our greatest first ladies if Hoover hadn't botched the Depression. She really made great strides in civil rights. At the time she was first lady, there was only one African-American congressman from Illinois named DePriest. And she would have little tea parties for the Republican women. And she invited Jessie DePriest, his wife, to one of these. And the South went nuts. Every newspaper in the South condemned her. And, her husband stood by her. They said, nope, this was the right thing to do. And they then began inviting the presidents of HBCUs to the White House to make their point. So she made some great strides in civil rights under great fire. She also was the first lady to give a speech over the radio. And she used the radio a lot during her time. Even had her own little practice studio. Eleanor Roosevelt, what did Eleanor not do? There will never be another Eleanor Roosevelt. But you know, some of the really significant things, she also made great strides in civil rights. She was the one behind anti-lynching laws. She was way ahead of her husband in terms of civil rights. She's also the first lady to go on foreign soil into a combat zone. She went to Guadalcanal. Pretty amazing. She, she was his eyes and ears and legs and fed him information from all across the country. And so Eleanor started news conferences, and she only invited women journalists, no offense, Bob, but she did it because they were having trouble making money. So she only invited women journalists so they would continue to have a job. She also was very supportive of women's rights. So, and then probably the greatest thing she did was Harry Truman appointed her as our first ambassador to the United Nations, and she then chaired the committee that wrote the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And she went toe-to-toe with the Soviet leadership on that. And she gave 2 speeches that were identified as 2 of the top 100 political speeches of the 20th century. So pretty amazing woman. Jackie Kennedy started the White House Historical Association. It's 63 years old now, and now the White House is no longer falling down like it was through most of its lifetime. In fact, it had to be gutted down to the walls in the Truman administration because it was shaking. There were holes in the floor. They were afraid the piano was going to fall into one of the rooms below, leaking. It was a mess, and she made sure that would never happen again. So that was one of her great legacies. Lady Bird Johnson, another leader in civil rights. In '64, after the Civil Rights Bill was passed, LBJ did not feel like he could go to the South to campaign, and they figured he was going to lose the South completely. Lady Bird got on a train with 200 members of the press, mainly women, and made 17 stops, starting in Alexandria, Virginia, ending in New Orleans. And LBJ ended up winning 3 of those states. But she took the South to task on the whole issue of civil rights. She also was an environmental first lady, way ahead of the game in terms of the environment. So pretty important. Pat Nixon, she became my husband's favorite first lady. Well, he helped me research this book. People have no idea what she did, but there's a new book out called The Mysterious Mrs. Nixon that sets the record straight on her. Pat Nixon is the only first lady to represent an American president in front of foreign legislators. She gave 2 speeches in Africa to parliaments representing her husband. She also took foreign aid down to Peru at a time when we had horrible relations with Peru and ended up being decorated by the Peruvian president and after an earthquake, and then that managed to make conditions better for Nixon than to have a better relationship. She was also responsible for getting the pandas at the Washington Zoo, and they are back. She finished what Jackie Kennedy started with the White House renovation. She did twice as much as Jackie Kennedy, but she wanted no publicity because she wanted Jackie to get that attention since she had started it all. So there were many things that she did, especially on volunteerism, and it was pretty important. Betty Ford. Probably one of the best things that Betty Ford did for all of us women in the room was she brought breast cancer out into the public. At the time in 1974, you could not say the word breast or cancer in the media. And she said both. And she went public with the fact that she had breast cancer and a mastectomy, and literally tens of thousands of women wrote to her and told her that they had gone for a checkup as a result of that and had had early detection. And then she continued to work with that. Afterwards, she did the same thing for alcohol and drug abuse. And that Betty Ford Center continues to do all of that. She also campaigned for the ERA and had to install a private phone so that she didn't use taxpayer money to call state legislators. And so she was way out there. Rosalind Carter. She got the First Lady a physical office until 1977. The First Ladies were still working out of their dressing rooms. And she actually got money allocated for the First Lady, got an actual office, and got a budget line. And she and Jimmy Carter both wrote in their memoirs, it was the biggest fight they had in the 70-some years of their marriage, because he had campaigned to cut government bureaucracy, and she's now adding to it. But he realized it was important. She also brought mental health out into the open. And some of you may have been there. I was there. She gave a speech on behalf of the Menninger Foundation at White Concert Hall several years ago, and she continued to champion mental health legislation. She and Betty Ford testified before Congress on that issue, and so, you know, she really did some very important things on that. Nancy Reagan, she masterminded what ended up being the end of the Cold War, and I would suggest you read the book, The Triumph of Nancy Reagan. I couldn't put it down. You get a totally different view of her, but she realized that the only way to do this was to get these two leaders to get to know one another as people. And she orchestrated a lot of behind the scenes on that. She also took on the drug war and did some things with the Just Say No that were very important. Barbara Bush, she had a picture that went viral, before we use that term, of her holding an AIDS baby. We kind of attribute a lot of that to Princess Diana, but Barbara Bush did that, and that picture made people realize that you couldn't get AIDS just by holding a baby that had it. And then she got her husband to go to the National Institutes of Health with Anthony Fauci, and then he went back and worked on AIDS legislation. She also formed a literacy foundation, which still exists and has given $100 million for literacy programs throughout the country. So, and she got legislation on literacy passed in the background. Hillary Clinton made history. I don't have to tell you a whole lot about Hillary. She also showed us what a First Lady cannot do, and that is don't go run policy. She learned that lesson the hard way. But what she did in Beijing with a speech that also made the top 100, Barbara Bush's Wellesley commencement speech was the third First Lady speech to make the top 100, and Hillary's Beijing speech was the fourth, was to put this whole issue of women's rights internationally, and especially what's being done in countries like Afghanistan right now. Laura Bush. Laura Bush was very actively involved in a program called PEPFAR, which was bipartisan legislation that has pretty well wiped out AIDS in Africa. And she was out there on the front lines promoting that. She also is the only First Lady to give a presidential radio address, and she gave it after 9/11, right before Thanksgiving, on the plight of Afghan women and girls. And she continues to support behind the scenes some of the programs that we've done for Afghan women. Michelle Obama made history just by being Michelle Obama. Broke the color barrier in the White House. And she gave a speech at the 2016 Democratic Convention in which she said she woke up every morning in a house built by slaves. They were not even totally aware at the White House Historical Association about that particular fact that had been hidden. 10 families brought their enslaved workers to the White House, starting with the Washingtons. That then sent the White House Historical Association on a mission to tell that story. And now there is an entire section on their website devoted to slavery in the President's neighborhood. And they've also put up historical markers all around the White House. What she did for kids, she did a lot for higher ed, so a lot of major changes there. And Dr. Biden made history by working outside the White House. Plus, she just started a multi-$100 million project on women's health. And so KU Med may get some of that money. But there is research money now being devoted exclusively to women's health. And then she and Michelle Obama continued work on veterans. Now, let's talk about Shawnee County and Topeka. One of the first things I learned when I moved here is there's no Pierce Street, right? And you all know why, right? Because when they had the Topeka Constitution, it was illegal, and Charles Robinson was elected governor under the Topeka Constitution, and Franklin Pierce promptly stuck him and several other Free State leaders into a prison over near what's now Lecompton. Sarah Robinson was from the same area of the East as Jane Pierce. And Sarah Robinson wrote a letter to Jane Pierce and explained, and Jane was an abolitionist. Franklin wanted this state to come in as a slave state. Jane disagreed with him. And Jane gets a letter from Sarah Robinson saying, you know, if you want this to be a free state, you got to get my husband and these other folks out of jail. And she did. She spent her first 2 years in mourning for a son who died 7 weeks before in an accident. She didn't do anything for 2 years except sit in her room in black, writing letters to her dead son and holding seances. And when she came out, one of the first things she did was change the course of history of the state of Kansas. So there is a Shawnee County tie to a first lady that's incredibly important. Edith Wilson, she came through here campaigning. And she and her husband were both in Topeka High and the Municipal Auditorium in 1916 for campaign speeches. And she was really one of the first ladies to actually go across the country campaigning with her husband. And one of those stops was Topeka, Kansas. And there's a picture of the Trumans, Bess and Harry and their daughter. And Bess, this is actually in Topeka at the train station where they were campaigning in 1948. So Bess made a trip through here. Mamie Eisenhower, and I couldn't find the picture. Where I was supposed to find the picture was some weird picture of a bunch of 60s guys hanging around, so I don't know what happened. But anyway, Mamie planted a tree in Topeka in honor of the centennial. And I've been trying to figure out exactly where that tree is, so maybe that's a project you all could take on. Is the Mamie Eisenhower tree from the centennial still here? But Mamie did do that. She also came through here when he did his victory tour after World War II, so she made a couple trips to Topeka. Eleanor Roosevelt. Eleanor was here in 1959, and this is her with Carl Menninger. And then here she is answering a question at a press conference at the Jayhawk Hotel. And she wrote an entire My Day column about her visit to Topeka. And February 14th, 1959, her My Day column is all about her visit to Topeka, Kansas. And she talks about meeting with Dr. Carl, having lunch with him. He explained the clinic. Then she talked about how the clinic worked. She talks about going to the brand new VA hospital. She went there, and an Air Force hospital, state psychiatric hospital, hospital for delinquent boys. She goes through her entire day in Topeka in her My Day column. So Topeka made national news. So there's Eleanor. Laura Bush came. Marge Petty and Laura Bush went to high school together. And Marge got her here for a gala fundraiser for the library. And here she is during the day talking to kids. She read books. And she gave a speech at the library. And her staff did their research. And here's an excerpt from that speech. It seems that around 1870, a group of gentlemen wished to establish a library to, in their words, be a place where young men can meet and spend their evenings in reading or social amusements to improve the mind and keep them from saloons and other places of vice. Then Laura Bush goes on to say, the women of Topeka, wise beyond the men's expectations, were dismayed by the thought of it. They had ideas about the sort of things that might really go on in a library created by and for men. Within days, a group of women got together and being not only swift but also organized, they formed their own library, which opened on March 11, 1871, and featured 40 new books and a secondhand bookcase, which was the beginnings of the Topeka Shawnee County Public Library. So Laura Bush really paid tribute, and she was a librarian. Then Michelle Obama, 60th anniversary of Brown v. Board. On May 17th, she did a program for the 3 Topeka schools, honor assembly, and gave an incredible speech, which I have written about this speech, and we talk about it in the book. But she really praised Topeka and much of what the Topeka schools had done to promote diversity. And she says, every day you have the power to choose our better history. By opening your hearts and minds, by speaking up for what you know is right, by sharing the lessons of Brown v. Board of Education, the lessons you all learned right here in Topeka, wherever you go for the rest of your lives, and I know you all can do it. So she really gave a pep talk and complimented these students. So we have a history right here with First Ladies who've made a difference and who've touched this community. So with that, if you have any questions or comments, I would be happy to answer them.
Oh, you're kidding. Surely someone has some questions.
Well, let me ask this question. Did you learn anything new?
Do you have a favorite?
Oh, do I have a favorite? I get that question all the time. I gave this kind of glib answer at the White House Historical Association, the one where the great